In World of Warcraft, there has been a lot of items that were since removed in the sense that you can no longer obtain them. The majority of these are items that come from the original version of the game, also known as Vanilla, and they were then made unobtainable when the game's third expansion, the Cataclysm, launched in 2010. Items that were once thought to be nothing out of the ordinary became incredibly rare and valuable overnight, and many players came to regret that they didn't go out in the old world and get them while they had the chance. Luckily for those players, there would come a second chance when World of Warcraft Classic released in 2019. The Classic version of the game was played on patch 1.12, which was the last patch of the original Vanilla WoW, and therefore all of those rare and unique items that the Cataclysm took away could once again be obtained. There was, however, a very small minority of items that were removed before patch 1.12, which excluded them from being in Classic and thus making them extremely rare. Today we'll be taking a look at 5 items that were all removed before the end of the original Vanilla WoW more than 17 years ago, the last of which being so rare that hardly anybody knows that it even existed. This is the story of Vanilla WoW's Lost Armor. If you play Shaman in the Classic version of the game, you will have a chance to complete a 2-step questline that starts in the Horde capital of Orgrimmar and awards the Skyfury Helm. While the Skyfury Helm is quite rare, having been removed long ago, we need to go even further back in the game's history, as the Skyfury Helm itself is actually the replacement of another helm, the Helm of Latent Power. The quest, called the Darkreal Menace, as well as its reward, the Helm of Latent Power, was introduced into the game in patch 1.4. The helm would only go on to exist for 3 patches, as it was replaced with the more well-known Skyfury Helm in patch 1.7, citing that it was a more fitting reward for the effort required to complete the questline. Players who had already completed the questline prior to this change were given a quest which they could instantly turn in order to receive the newly added Skyfury Helm. This new quest was appropriately called a more fitting reward. While the Helm of Latent Power is incredibly rare in retail WoW due to it existing for only 3 patches as well as the quest being quite difficult at the time, it was actually still obtainable for a short while in the Classic version of the game before it was removed in favor of the Skyfury Helm in later content phases. This did give some Classic players the chance to obtain it once more, something that wouldn't be the case for the remaining 4 items. The second item, or rather group of items, were the Winter-Axe Epaulets, Deep-Rooted Ring, Frostbound Headdress and Frozen Steel Vambraces. These items were introduced into the game with the Alterac Valley Battleground in patch 1.5 and would drop off of Iris the Forest Lord and Lokolar the Ice Lord, who were bosses that players could summon to aid their faction in the battle. The items were removed from the drop tables in the very next patch, patch 1.6, and for this reason, players who kill them in the Classic version of the game will not see any of these drops. While they are rarely seen, these 2 bosses themselves were never removed, but due to the changes in Alterac Valley's game pace, players rarely summon them in the retail version of the game. During a time-limited anniversary event, it was possible to get lookalikes for all 4 of these items, but the original versions of these that had the rare item quality were never reintroduced. As a little side note, the Winter-Axe Epaulets is one of the few items in the game that contain a typo, as its name is written with an E in the end as opposed to the Winter-Axe Trolls, which the item is meant to represent. For the next item, we have to look at the quest called Gazrilla, which was removed in the Cataclysm expansion. Here, the player along with their group had to summon and take down the Hydra boss in the Sulfurak dungeon. In the Classic version of the game, this quest is quite popular as it rewards the carrot on the stick item, which in many cases is the first trinket slot item that a player can get. What is less commonly known is that this trinket used to be just one of 2 reward options. When the game launched, players could also choose the Speedy Racer goggles, which was a cloth type armor item. Unlike other goggles at the time, which required the engineering profession, these could be worn by anybody. The goggles were removed in patch 1.9.4 and would never be introduced back into the game, not even when Classic launched. The final 2 items were both found in the Molten Core raid zone. The Molten Core was initially the hardest content that was available for players when the game launched in 2004, and Blizzard rushed to make the zone, which was famously developed in just 1 week. While the real timescale is more like 2 weeks, it is still incredibly fast considering it was the first full-scale raid zone, so at the time there was no template on how a raid zone should work. As a result of this fast development, the loot tables were different to what players in Classic would come to experience, as both Tier 1 and Tier 2 items would drop off of the zone's bosses. This could be seen as somewhat of an oversight, as Tier 2 items are substantially more powerful than Tier 1 items. But the true oversight, as it turns out, was found in the loot table of Pngtree, who in launch had a 1% chance to drop the Talisman of Binding Shard. This was a next slot item of the legendary quality that gave the player a permanent visual effect identical to that of the Shaman's Lightning Shield. The item was never intended for players to be able to loot, and when it first dropped for a player named Nocturne, Blizzard quickly realized the mistake and issued a hotfix removing the item from Pngtree's loot table. Luckily, Nocturne was allowed to keep his unique legendary item, which from this moment onwards would be the most rare piece of equipment, as only one of them exists across the entire game. Due to the item being legendary, as well as its extreme rarity and story behind it, it is fairly well known among the WoW player base. But this is something that isn't the case for the last item, that although dropping from the same raid zone, the Molten Core is much less known to players. As the Molten Core released in somewhat of an imbalanced state, with different tiers of items dropping from the same bosses, Blizzard sought out to clean the loot tables, which they would do in patch 1.4. With this patch, the random tier 2 items were removed, and the bosses would now only drop tier 1 items. If you play in Classic WoW, you will see that Ragnaros actually still drops tier 2 leg pieces, and this is a remnant of the old system that existed from patch 1.1 up until patch 1.4. The items that were removed in patch 1.4 were made unobtainable for a little while, which players didn't really appreciate at the time. But soon after this, in patch 1.6, when the Blackwing Lair was added to the game, they learned that they can now enter the new raid zone and continue looting all of the powerful items that Blizzard had previously removed. But they were all of them deceived, as Ragnaros also used to drop a ring called the Ragnaros Core, which although being one of the items removed in patch 1.4, it would not be reintroduced along with the others in patch 1.6. This was kind of a shame, as it had a lot of fire resistance, a stat that is important for players to stack on certain boss fights in both the Molten Core or Nyx's Lair, as well as the Blackwing Lair zone. As the ring was removed so early in the game's history, much earlier than patch 1.12, which the classic version is based on, it would never drop again, neither on retail or any classic versions of the game. Over the years, it has only become more rare, and at this point, hardly anybody remembers that it even used to exist.